A masterpiece from the great Jose Raul Capablanca. In this game, he uses a strategic concept that any of us can immediately apply to our own games to play better chess. This particular game was played at the London International in 1922 against Henry Ernest Adkins, who was given the International Master title in 1950. He was a very strong player. He wasn't a professional, but he participated in the British Chess Championships 11 times and won it 9 of those 11 times. So a strong opponent for Capablanca, who has the white pieces. Capablanca has the black pieces. Atkins has white. Let us jump right in. White begins with e4. Capablanca responds with the Caro-Kann defense. c6, d4, d5. Black is trying to create a strong point on d5, but not block his queen's bishop, allow it to develop, unlike, say, a French defense where that bishop is blocked. White plays the advanced variation, e5, that allows the bishop to develop outside of the pawn chain. So this is good for black. The only downside is he needs to play c5 to undermine white's center, and he's lost a tempo. So he gets the bishop out of the pawn chain, but he has to lose that tempo with c5. And white immediately challenges Capablanca's bishop with bishop to d3. Capablanca happily exchanges those bishops and plays e6. And we see Capablanca has created a wall of light squared pawns which complement his dark squared bishop very well. Knight to e2, queen to b6, a natural square for the queen where it puts some pressure on b2, d4, and supports c5 push. Castle, and queen to a6. Capablanca is ready to immediately go into an endgame, probably thinking he had less space. Therefore, with queens off the board, it would benefit him. White avoids that exchange and plays queen to d1. Now, the thematic c5, attacking the base of white's pawn chain. c3 defends. Knight to c6, adding another attacker to the base of the pawn chain. And now knight to d2. And usually this idea in a position like this is maybe to go to f3 and overprotect the d4 pawn. But what Capablanca does, first he takes on d4 and then plays this little move, queen to d3, attacking the pawn twice and basically forcing the knight to move so the queens will be exchanged. The knight goes to b3 and queens come off of the board, knight g to e7. So looking at this position, we see white has a space advantage. Capablanca has a target that he can work on with d4. Maybe the knight can go to f5. But perhaps the dominant strategic issue here is the open c file. And I want you to watch the way Capablanca dominates that file. In this position, he's in no position to dominate the file. Watch how he gets control of that c file. Really amazing. Bishop to d2. Now a5, with the prospect of playing a4 and irritating that b3 knight. Rook a to c1 from white, and b6, that keeps the knight out of c5. And white's position looks good. White's already on the c file. How is Capablanca going to turn that around? a4 from white to keep this pawn from irritating the knight. If he played a4 here, the knight would have had to go to a1. But that does create a weakness on b4, just as white has a weakness to exploit on b5. So king to d7 from Capablanca. And there's a lot of little advantages here, and one of the little advantages Capablanca has is his king is closer to the center than white's king is. It will take some time for white's king to become activated. Knight to c3 aims at that weak b5 square. Capablanca plays knight to a7 to help keep that square under control. If the knight lands, Capablanca would just capture it. King to f1, the march towards the center begins. Knight e to c6, putting pressure on b4 as well as the d4 pawn. King to e2, and rook to c8. And to look at the position, black is still miles away from dominating this c-file. Watch what happens. Bishop to e1 clears the way for the rook to defend the pawn. Bishop to e7, developing the bishop. Knight to b1, and I think the idea behind this knight to b1 move is to play the bishop to that square so that the knight's not on it. A bishop on c3 completely overprotects that d4 pawn. But now f5 from Capablanca. So white has a choice. He can either allow this pawn structure to become fixed in the center, where black's pawns control the light squares while his bishop controls the dark squares, or he can take en passant. International Master Atkins decides to go ahead and take en passant. Capablanca takes with the bishop. But that's an extra piece attacking d4. And yes, it's true black now has a weakness at e6, but like a lot of the great players, they know which weaknesses are a problem and which are not. And this e6 pawn, while a weakness, it's almost impossible for white to target it. There's no way for white to get at it. Bishop to c3 overprotects d4. The knight goes to b4. The other knight's probably going to shift in to c6. Bishop to d2 offers an exchange of rooks. Knight a to c6 avoids that exchange. Bishop to e3. Now, here comes the move that really is the brilliant move. So far, it's a competitive game. Black may have a little pressure. But this key move by Capablanca is the strategic essence of this game. He plays knight to a2. Now, why is that a good move? By controlling the c1 square, obviously he's hitting the rook will have to move. He makes it impossible for white to arrange his rooks in such a way that he can double on the c-file. So white can't really double on the c-file right now because Capablanca controls that c1 square. And this is what becomes a problem for white. Rook to c2. Now Capablanca plays rook to c7. He's going to double. He can double just fine. Knight to a3. The idea of coming into b5 and irritating this rook. But then just rook h to c8. What if white plays knight to b5 here? Well, then knight to d4 check is actually what Capablanca would play, and that reveals pressure down the c-file after taking on d4. Rook takes, knight takes, rook takes, king to d3 could be played, but then just knight to b4 would be mate. So he wouldn't want to do that. So he'd want to block it, but then just takes, and king to c7. And black is completely winning in this position. He's up material with enormous pressure. The game would be over here. So because of that, white cannot pop that knight into b5 yet. So instead, rook c to d2, and now knight to a7, keeping this knight out of b5. And look at the rooks. That c-file, Capablanca has total control over it, with the rooks doubled on the c-file and white's rook stuck here over on the d-file. Really amazing. Rook to d3, knight to b4 hits that rook. The rook just goes back. Rook to c6, rook to b1. Bishop to e7. One of the ideas here is that he will remove this knight at b4, play bishop takes knight, and then get this c2 square as a penetration point. At the moment, this knight controls that square, so he wants to get rid of it. Rook to a1, bishop to d6, hitting the h2 pawn, sort of. h3, rook c7, rook a to d1. The knight goes back to a2, and this reveals the bishop's pressure on that knight at a3. And Atkins plays rook to a1, and now Capablanca snaps that knight off, giving him much better control over this c2 square. White takes the knight. The bishop comes back to b4, hitting that rook, a little tempo. Rook to d1. Now here Capablanca could play rook to c2 check, penetrating, that's fine. But he plays rook to c4 first, rook to c1, and now, as is so often the case, when you get one advantage, you want to transition that to another greater advantage. And Capablanca plays knight to c6. White goes ahead and takes the rook. This, of course, closes the c-file completely, but instead, Capablanca gets some very nice advantages. Watch this minor piece battle. The knight goes back to d2, aiming at this pawn, but now bishop d2, bishop takes d2, or excuse me, king takes d2, and notice the difference between this knight and this bishop. This knight is much stronger than that bishop with all kinds of potential squares. It can go to b4, it could reroute to the d5 square. The knight is much better than this bishop, which is stuck defending d4 right now. First, Capablanca moves his king into a better position, aiming at d5. King c3, king to d5. Rook a1, just moving his pawns to light squares. g7, g6, so it can't be attacked by the bishop. f3, rook to b8. So Capablanca's idea is to play b5 and penetrate along a newly opened b file. Rook to a3, so that when the file opens, black cannot play rook to b3 check. The rook wants to control that square. b5, ab5, rook takes b5. Bishop to f2. Now knight to b4, aiming to pop into that d3 square and create all kinds of trouble, attacking the pawn at b2. b3 is played, pawn takes, and here he takes with the king. What if he takes with the rook? Well, in that case, knight to a2 check would force the exchange of rooks after king c2, rooks come off. But then knight to c1 check, and this knight causes all kinds of trouble. If king to c2, knight to e2, aims at the pawn at d4, and if he tries to defend it with king to d3, then knight to f4 check, and Capablanca would win the g2 pawn. So to prevent all those tactics, Atkins places his king along the line of this potential discovery. He knows the other line loses, but now knight to c6 check, king to c3, rook to b1 with the idea of causing havoc on the back rank. Rook to a4, rook to c1 check, king to d2, the rook comes to c4. He's offering the exchange of rooks. The minor piece endgame is easily winning for Capablanca with the outside passed pawn and the better knight versus the bishop. So Atkins avoids the exchange of rooks. But now a4, the pawn advances, of course, defended by the rook at c4. Rook to a3 to blockade the pawn, but now knight to a7, threatening to come to b5, where it hits the blockading rook and also attacks the d4 pawn. Rook to a1, knight to b5, rook to b1. And here, the move knight takes d4 does work, but Capablanca is patient, torturing his opponent with king to c6 to defend the knight. King to d3, rook to c3 check, king to d2, and rook to b3, happily offering the exchange of rooks. If those rooks come off, this is an easy win again for Capablanca. After king to c1, he just comes in and wins this endgame no problem. So again, white avoids the exchange of rooks. King to b7, rook to c2, a3, the potential of playing rook to b2. Now bishop to g3. If this knight moves, perhaps white can cause some trouble with rook to c7 check, but Capablanca is not worried about that at all, and he goes ahead and takes on d4, allowing that check. Rook to c7 check, the king just moves up. Here, if white takes on h7, then just a2, and there's nothing he can do to stop this pawn. This square is controlled by the king, so the rook can't get at it, and black would just win. So instead, he plays the rook to c4, attacking the knight and wanting to shift behind the pawn. The king just goes to b5, controlling that square and offering up his knight. And if white takes Capablanca's knight, then again, a2, it's the same problem. There's just nothing he can do to stop it from advancing. So because of that, white plays rook to c8, trying to get the rook behind the pawn via the a8 square. But now knight to c6, that controls the square, the checking square. Rook to a8, rook to b2 check, king to e3, rook to g2, takes g2, and that attacks the bishop. So white doesn't have time to take the pawn. The bishop moves, and now knight to b4. The knight's in a perfect position to support the advance of the pawn, and here white resigned. And the reason is that if white were to take the pawn, then this move, knight to c2 check, forking the king and the rook. Brilliant the way Capablanca was able to dominate that c file and then use that to win the game. I hope you have enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.